Hello students, welcome to Unacademy. I am Krishna Verma, a verified educator, and this is the first lesson of our new course. The course name is Ignition System, and generally this ignition system is used in spark ignition engine, and this lesson is all about the introduction of ignition system. And this ignition system is generally used to generate the spark in spark plug for the proper combustion of fuel in combustion chamber. So let's start our lesson. These are the contents of today's lesson. First, I will discuss about the introduction of ignition system. Then, what are the basic requirement of ignition system? And third, what are the types of ignition system, or how many types of ignition system we have to study in this particular course. So, I will cover these three topics in today's lesson. So, let's start our lesson with the introduction of ignition system, or what is this ignition system actually. So, as we all know that generally the combustion takes place into the engine. The combustion takes place in both type of engine, in compression ignition engine as well as in spark ignition engine, as I already discussed in previous lectures of the combustion of the SI engine and combustion in CI engine. And if we are talking about spark ignition engine here, or SI engine, so in SI engine for the combustion of the fuel we need spark plug. And the spark which is generated from the spark plug is used to ignite the fuel into the combustion chamber or into the engine. So the question is, how the spark generated into the engine, or in SI engine we use spark plug to generate the spark, but the question is from where the spark comes, or from where the spark generated into the spark plug. This is the main question. So the general answer is, in a spark ignition engine, the spark will generate because of the charge of the batteries. The batteries is the main source of the electricity, and this the spark is generated because of the charge of the batteries. And there is a battery installed into the engine. As you all know, there is a battery into the engine or in automobile engine, and this battery supply the charge, and this charge will generate the spark. But in generally the capacity of battery is very low. The battery produce very less current, or the battery will transfer very less voltage. The voltage amount is around 12 to 24 volt. The very less voltage will transferred by the batteries. But in ignition system, if we are talking about ignition system for the SI engine, so this ignition system require very high amount of current for the generation of the spark. So how we can get this high amount of current to generate the spark in ignition system or in spark plug, and how this ignition system work, and what are the basic requirement and the basic components of the ignition system, etc., we'll study in this particular lesson as well as in upcoming lessons. So let's start with what is this ignition process and what is this ignition system. So I will start with the ignition process. So this ignition process is basically the process of initiation of combustion into the cylinder or into the combustion chamber. The spark which is generated from the spark plug, if we are talking about spark ignition engine, so the spark is generally generated into the spark plug in SI engine, and this spark will helps to ignite the fuel and air mixture. The charge we consider in SI engine as the fuel and air mixture, and the process of generation of spark to ignite the fuel or the fuel air mixture is called ignition process. Ignition process is the process of generation of spark to ignite the fuel and air mixture, and this process is only related to initiation of combustion. This process is only related to initiation of combustion, but this process is not related to the behavior of combustion. This process is only related to initiation of combustion, and it generally gives only energy for the start of combustion and for the proper combustion into the combustion chamber or into the cylinder. And the energy which is supplied from the spark plug to the fuel charge or the fuel air mixture will burn the fuel, and this particular process will change the chemical state of the charge or the fuel charge or the fuel air mixture, and this particular process will release the chemical energy, and this chemical energy will transfer in the form of thermal energy in this particular ignition process. So this is about ignition process. Now let's talk about what is the ignition system. I told you about I explained about the ignition process. Now let's move toward the ignition system, or what is this ignition system. So we generally consider different conditions of operation during the whole operation or whole combustion process or whole operation of the engine. So this ignition system is generally required to supply sufficient amount of energy for certain period of time to generate flame or to generate spark in different conditions of operation. See, this ignition system is basically the combination of different components or different parts, and these components will help to generate required amount of spark or required amount of current to generate the spark in spark plug, and that spark will help to start the ignition into the combustion chamber. From that required amount of current, we'll get required amount of spark in spark plug, and that spark will helps to ignite the fuel or for the complete combustion of the fuel in combustion chamber. So this is about ignition system. What is this ignition system, or how this ignition system works? Now let's move towards the basic requirement of the ignition system. What are the basic requirements of the ignition system during the ignition of the fuel charge? So the first requirement, a source of electrical energy. A source of electrical energy is always required in ignition system. For example, battery. The battery is the example of the source of electrical energy. The battery is used as the source of electrical energy in battery ignition system. That is one type of ignition system. I will discuss it later. So there is always a source of electrical energy is required during the ignition process in the ignition system. The second requirement is the system should supply sufficient amount of current to produce high amount of spark in spark plug. There is always a sufficient amount of current should supply to produce high amount of spark in the spark plug. The third requirement is the system should be able to produce high voltage for the all condition of operation. Either it is multi-cylinder, if we are talking about multi-cylinder engine operation, or whatever condition it is. So the system should able to produce the high voltage for all conditions of operation. And if we are talking about battery ignition system, so generally the battery is used as the source of electrical energy. So the battery generally produce low voltage. So the ignition system should be able to convert that low voltage into high voltage, which is required for the generation of the spark in ignition system, or for proper ignition of the or for proper combustion of the fuel in ignition process. So this is the third requirement. And the fourth requirement is the duration of the spark should be long. Generally, the duration of the spark should be considered as whatever duration we are considering, the duration of the spark should be long with sufficient energy, and this long duration will create the chances of proper ignition into the combustion chamber. The fifth requirement is the timing of distribution of high voltage into the spark plug should be exact. If we are talking about multi-cylinder engine, or in case of multi-cylinder engine, there are number of spark plugs are situated, or number of spark plugs are used in each cylinder, or for each cylinder we use each or single, or in each cylinder we use a spark plug. For a number of spark plug we generally used during the multi-cylinder engine operation. So for that condition, the timing of the distribution of high voltage into the spark plug should be exact, and for this particular condition there should be a proper distributing device situated into the ignition system. So the requirement is that this condition, or for this condition, there should be a distributing device situated into the ignition system. So these are the basic requirements of the ignition system. Now let's move toward the types of ignition system. What are the basic types of ignition system? As I told you, as the first requirement of the ignition system, there should be a source of electrical energy into the ignition system. This is the first requirement of the ignition system. So the source of electrical energy in ignition system is generally considered. There are a lot of source of electrical energy which is generally used in ignition system. Those sources are batteries, magneto, generator, etc. So the basic ignition system are generally classified on the basis of source of supply of electrical energy. The ignition system are classified on the basis of source of supply of electrical energy. So these are the basic types of ignition system. These types of ignition system are: first type is battery ignition system, second is magneto ignition system, and third is electronic ignition system. So these are the main type of ignition system, and I will explain these type of ignition system, all three type of ignition system in upcoming lessons. So these are the basic type of ignition system we have to study in this particular course of ignition system. So this is all about the introduction of the ignition system, basic requirements of ignition system, as well as these type of ignition system we have to study in this particular course. Thank you so much for listening. You can rate and review this lesson, and you can share this lesson with your friends and known people. This is my link on Unacademy. You can follow me through this link on Unacademy, and please subscribe Unacademy. Thank you so much.